So again, it's chapter 4, and we're covering tissues. And we've covered epithelial tissue, and we've covered a lot of connective tissue. And what we have remaining is some tissues, bone tissue, and blood, and lymph, and muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Excuse me. Many of these tissues we'll actually look at in a lot more detail later on, either in this course or in the next courses 40B and 40C. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, for example, with bone tissue, because we're going to cover that in a great deal of time and detail once we get to the chapter on bone tissue. Same is true with muscle tissue. And blood, you have a whole chapter devoted to blood later on in 40B. And you have a chapter that talks about lymph, which is going to be in 40C. That would be the immune system. So a lot of these other tissues that I'm going to cover now will be, you'll devote whole chapters to later on in the course of you taking these series of courses. So let's begin with bone tissue. And when we talk about bone tissue, it can be confusing sometimes because bone tissue, or probably more properly skeletal, the skeletal system actually is composed of more than one type of tissue. So when you talk about the skeletal system, and let's just get that. We're talking about bone tissue. We're talking about tendons and ligaments. We're talking about the periosteum, which is a dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds bone. The endosteum. And we're talking about red and yellow bone marrow. So what is it do I mean when I write down these words here, bone tissue? And I'm going to specifically lay that out. So bone tissue is compact bone and spongy bone, and it's got a particular structure to it. It fulfills the requirements of connective tissue in the sense that it had fibers and has a ground substance, and it has cells. So it fits all those requirements, and we're going to get into the real details of how bone is put together, as I said in the chapter on bone tissue. But let's just cover some of the basics today, and then we'll come back, as I said, later and get into more detail. So in terms of bones, there are two types of bone. One of those is referred to as compact bone. And the simplest way to describe this, or the character of this type of bone, is there are no spaces. And I'm going to expand on that. Now, you'll understand what that word means once we look at the difference between compact bone and spongy bone. So the second type of tissue is spongy bone. And here we have spaces. In fact, that's how it got its name. So when we talk about compact bone, we have some structures that are going to be important in knowing. So compact bone, let's take a look at that. So compact bone, the basic structural unit of compact bone is called the osteon. And the osteon looks something like this. So let's go ahead and bring that image up. So this is a basic structure that I talked about, the basic structural unit of compact bone is the osteon. In the center is a structure called the central canal. And then if you look closely, there's a pattern here of concentric rings that are form around that central canal. And this might remind you a little bit of a bullseye type of construction. The other thing that I like to think about, especially when you're looking at a large section of this tissue, which you will be later on, is it looks like a bunch of tree stumps next to each other. So you know how trees have the rings in them? Well, this kind of reminds me of that. It may not at this point with you, but when you see a whole bunch of these together, I think that that's an image that might come to mind as you're looking at it. So what is involved here? What's happening here? Well, this is actually a space, central canal, and we'll find blood vessels there. And then these concentric rings that you're looking at here, that's the hardened or the mineralized matrix. And these dark spots that you see right there are small openings in which cells are living, something along the lines of what you see in this picture right here. And again, we're going to use the term lacuna to describe these small spaces in which the cells, and you notice that we have an osteocyte, that's the mature form. So osteoblasts built this system, and once they become trapped within the matrix, then they become osteocytes. So there's my calcified matrix. Then there's these little tunnels that you'll notice here and here and here. And those tunnels correspond to these lines that look like little cracks in the matrix. You see how these little lines, these little radiating lines, those are actually these structures that you see right here. So what's this all about? Well, this is your source of nutrients, where the blood vessels are. So the blood vessels are here. There would be a small artery and a small vein sitting right in this opening, the central canal. But all these cells that you see out here, they're living cells. And look at the distance that we have to get information or oxygen or waste materials from this location out to this cell, or from that cell back to this location. How do we do that? We're certainly not going to depend on diffusion, because this is calcified material. If we were waiting for diffusion to get oxygen and nutrients to the cell, that cell would be long dead before anything arrived. So how are we going to keep that cell alive? Well, these cells that you see closest to this centralized location where the blood vessel is, they have these little extensions here that are going to extend out, and they're actually going to open up into this space. So they'll have direct access to the blood vessels in this space here. So this cell is physically connected to this space through a tunnel like this. And there's a process. That cell extends into that tunnel. And so it actually is physically in contact with that opening. So at the end of this, there would be a place, an opening into this space, the central canal, and nutrients would flow into the cell through that process. So now the cell has got oxygen, it's got glucose and whatever, and can get rid of waste materials back out into the vein here. This cell is also connected to its neighbor. So this cell is connected to that cell, which is connected to that cell, which is connected to that cell. So there's this interconnection starting here at the central canal and radiating outwards to the outer edges of the osteon. So all these cells are interconnected through these little canals, which are called canaliculi. Okay, and because the cells are touching each other through those little tiny tunnels or canals, and that is how these cells way out here in the edge can maintain their metabolism, can maintain life, because they are interconnected through a series of cells to the actual source of the nutrients, the oxygen, and where they want to dump waste. So that's how that arrangement works. Let's go ahead and add some information then in the way of our notes. So the osteon is composed of a number of structures. The lamellae, let's go back to that. I want to show you what that lamellae is. And here we go. So for each central canal, we have a whole series of rings around it, concentric rings, and the collection of concentric rings are the lamellae. So I've got, looks like I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly 6 rings around that central canal, and all of those rings make up the lamellae. Okay. So this is a series of concentric rings of matrix around the central canal. Okay. So let's go ahead. Here's my central canal. And we're going to go ahead and put in a couple of these rings. Okay. So this is my central canal, and so that will be number 2. Okay, the central canal then is an opening in which blood vessels are located. So that's going to be my central canal, and so let's go ahead and put in a blood vessel here. There's my artery, and let's put in a vein. So that's my central canal. Okay, and let's see. I'm going to use. Let's just go ahead and do this. That's blue too. I don't have a black pen. That's okay. So that's my central canal. Okay. And the lamellae are that series of concentric circles. Okay. And then number 3, I'm going to have the lacunae. Lacuna. And these are small spaces between lamellae, contain osteocytes. So let's go ahead and put in some of those, make them a little bit darker so we can see them better. Okay, and that would be the lacunae. And then we have canaliculi. And these are small canals / tunnels connecting lacunae. Right, and why don't we go ahead? I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to do this in red, even though we already have red. I just want to make that stand out so we can see them. These are the small tunnel-like structures, okay? Connecting one to the other. So we're gonna come back to this structure a lot. We're gonna draw this again in more detail when we get into the chapter. This is just an introduction. All right, so that's compact bone. What about spongy bone? What's happening with spongy bone? Well, spongy bone is not like that at all. In fact, spongy bone has no osteons. So no osteons. And in fact, what it consists of, a network of columns and these are called trabeculae. I'm going to have a very nice set of pictures showing you what that's going to look like. And there are spaces between the trabeculae that are filled with red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is the site of production of blood cells. All blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. And there's, maybe I will try it. So you're going to get something along these lines. It's going to be quite extensive. I can't really do this justice, but I'm hoping you get some sense from this picture of what I'm talking about. Fantastic network of, and I'm just going to color this, so this will be all bone here. And that, so this is my trabeculae here, these structures right here. And in this space right here, I'll fill it in with yellow. The spaces between it, that's where my red bone marrow is located. So this is my red bone marrow. Okay. So we get something along these lines like that. All right, function, support, protection, movement, storage of minerals, blood cell production, energy storage, so that's bone material. So the next type of tissue that we want to look at is blood. And believe it or not, that is considered to be connective tissue. But let's take a look at how this is possible. And let's look at that matrix, which, remember, is supposed to be composed of fibers and a ground substance. So the ground substance is blood plasma, which is the liquid portion of blood. What about the fibers, though? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to replace the fibers with cells. And so instead of fibers, we're going to have cells. And we're going to call that formed elements. Okay. So we're going to have cells instead of fibers. So none cells take the place of fibers. And that's a terrible job, but there it is. Okay. So no fibers, but cells instead. And we're called those formed elements. And of course, what we're talking about are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay. Finally, there is lymph, which is also a fluid connective tissue. Okay. And this is basically interstitial fluid found within the lymphatic system. Okay. The difference between the interstitial fluid and actual lymph is that lymph has fewer proteins. Okay. And it has no blood cells. You're going to talk about lymph when you do the immune system in 40C, and you'll see how this tissue, or fluid, I should say, that is normally circulating around cells ends up in the lymphatic system. And you'll take a look at that, and it's kind of an interesting story. All right. So that finishes up connective tissue. What we have left is muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and then I want to talk about some membranes. So let's begin with muscle tissue. Okay, muscle tissue. As you know, there are 3 types. And the first type is skeletal muscle tissue. And we devote a whole chapter talking about this. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. We know that it's, for the most part, it's attached to bone. Not every single muscle in the body, skeletal muscle, is attached to bone. Some is attached to soft tissue and other muscles. But generally, we can say attached to bone. It is striated. Okay. It is voluntary. That is, you can consciously move these muscles when you want to. And the muscle cells are long and cylindrical. With many nuclei. Okay. And the nuclei are on the periphery of the cell. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at, well, we'll take a look at blood. I forgot to show you blood. So we'll look at that very quickly. So let's do that. All right, so most people have seen blood and kind of have a sense of what that looks like. So here are the 3 different types of cells: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and in between them is the ground substance, which happens to be blood plasma. Okay, blood plasma. All right, so what were we talking about? Skeletal muscle. Here we are. There we are, skeletal muscle. So long and cylindrical. Nuclei on the periphery, more than one nucleus in a cell. We've got these striations, this light and dark pattern here, and typically associated with attachment to muscles. We also have cardiac muscle. That would be number 2. And this, of course, is found only in the heart. It is also striated, though it is involuntary. Okay. The cells are branched, usually with one nucleus. It is centrally located. And the cells are connected is called the intercalated disc. All right. So let's take a look at a picture. All right, so not so easily seen the branching because the cells are all kind of squished together. You have to kind of tease them apart to actually see the branching effect, but you can see it here in the drawing. Cells are branched, centrally located nuclei. We have the striations, okay? And we have these connections. These are the dark lines that you're seeing there. Those are the intercalated discs. Very special type of connection, and that will be developed later when you do the chapter in 40B on the heart. So you have a whole chapter devoted to the heart, and you'll learn all about that cardiac muscle tissue there. And finally, and this would be number 3, smooth muscle. So smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of hollow organs and vessels. Okay. Its function, I am assuming you know what the function of the heart muscle is, right? To push blood through the circulatory system. Its function is movement of food, okay, constriction of blood flow, and birth. So a number of different functions there. And let's go ahead and take a look at a picture. Smooth muscle. You know, smooth muscle kind of gets the short end of the stick in this course. We don't spend any time at all really describing the cell and its internal structure and how it works, which is unfortunate. It's kind of an interesting cell, but we just don't have time. We talk a lot about it without actually describing very much of how it's organized. But here in the artery, you can see there's a whole wall of smooth muscle that makes up the wall of the artery. And you get these spindle-shaped cells, so they're involuntary spindle-shaped cells with a single nucleus. And the reason we have this would be looks like it might be a muscular artery. And this wall of smooth muscle can be stimulated to constrict and reduce the size of the lumen. By doing that, by restricting the size of the lumen, you can get 2 different functions out of that. Number 1, you increase blood pressure. So if blood pressure is dropping, for example, one of the reactions that will happen is certain arteries in your body will constrict, thus increasing blood pressure. Another function you get out of constricting the diameter of an artery is you can redirect blood flow. So your body has the capacity to constrict certain blood vessels and dilate other blood vessels. So, for example, if you're running, blood vessels that are supplying blood to your legs will dilate, whereas blood vessels that are supplying blood to the digestive tract will constrict. So you'll have less blood flow into the digestive tract and more blood flow into the muscles of the leg. And you can do that by controlling this layer of muscle here in the arteries. Okay. All right, the last type of tissue is nervous tissue. And once again, there's a whole chapter devoted to this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But this consists of two types of cells. So that's kind of interesting. I think it is anyway. Two types of cells. And I just think about the complexity of behavior that is possible as a result of our nervous system. We can build computers. We can go to the moon. We can create art, poetry, music, all of these things that we're capable because of our central nervous system. And yet that system, which produces all this very complex and wonderful behavior, is only composed of two different types of cells. And those cells, of course, one are neurons, which most people have already heard of. And so these are the cells that are sensitive to stimuli, and they produce a nerve impulse, also known as an action potential. Right. So these are the ones that most people think about when they think about nervous tissue, is the neurons. The cell body is composed of parts. So we have the actual cell body itself. We have what is called the axon, which is a long process, and we have dendrites. That's typically what we would see. There are, of course, great variations in the different types of cells, but they're all varied around this central idea. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at that before we talk about the second type of cell. So I have the cell body. This is where we find the nucleus. I have the axon, which is this long process. And then I have these shorter processes that are sticking off here. Those are the dendrites, so basic structure of a neuron. And then if you look closely, in this picture, they're identifying these dark dots as the nuclei of neuroglia cell. And that's the second type of cell that we find in the nervous system. So we have the neuron, and then neuroglia cells. Those are the two different types of cells. So let's talk about that. So neuroglia cells. And they have a supporting role in nervous tissue. And I'm not going to talk about what they do in detail, but I will tell you that without neuroglia cells, your nervous system would not function. So they are not unimportant. They are as important as the neuron. Your entire system would break down and not function if you did not have neuroglia cells. They're extremely important. And you will learn how important when you do the chapter on nervous tissue. All right. Well, we've just got a little bit left, and that little bit is going to be about membranes. So we have talked about membranes. We've mentioned a number of different types of membranes. Really haven't defined what a membrane is yet. And so we're going to do that right now. We're going to talk about the three principal types of membranes in the body, and we're actually going to define what exactly is a membrane. So when we call something a membrane, why does it fit that description? So here it is. It is a combination of epithelial of an epithelial layer of cells, of course, and an underlying connective tissue. Does that sound very familiar? Because when we talked about epithelial tissues, this is how we described it: a layer of cells supported by a basement membrane. That's a membrane. So there are three principal types. I will list them, and then we'll spend a little bit of time describing each one. Number one, mucous membrane. Number two, a serous membrane. Both of those should be ringing bells to you, and if they're not, you should probably do a little studying. So mucous membranes and serous membranes we've been talking about from time to time, quite a bit actually. This third type, really haven't mentioned it, so it should be new to you: synovial membranes. Those are the three principal types of membranes. Let's begin with the mucous membrane and talk a little bit about the details of that, and then serous membrane, and finally synovial membrane, and then we'll be done with this chapter. So mucous membranes. Yeah, that's the way they spell mucous membranes. This is mucus, which is a substance, so that's misspelled. Anyways, forget about it. Pretend like I didn't do that. Okay, here we go. Let's do it. Lines, body cavities. That open to the exterior, meaning the outside world. Okay. Let's list them. They are digestive system, open at both ends to the outside world. Number two, respiratory system, open only at one end, which makes it kind of inefficient. Hopefully your instructor in 40B will talk about that. Respiratory system. Number three is reproductive system. Okay. And number four, the urinary system. All of these systems have openings to the outside world. They have to. If you want food to get into your body, you have to have an opening for it. If you want the waste material to leave, you have to have another opening for it. If you want air to come into your body, you have to have an opening for it. If you want to have a baby come out of your body, you have to have an opening for it. You have to have an opening in which the sperm can enter. Urinary system, again, if you want to get rid of that waste, you have to have an opening. So they're all necessary, but they all produce a risk in that something can invade your body through those openings. And so the mucous membrane is designed to protect you from that possibility. So it forms a barrier against microbes, parasites, and disease. Okay? It consists of tight junctions. Okay. It also has goblet cells that secretes the mucus, prevents drying. So mucus is going to prevent the drying out of that layer. It's going to be used to trap particles, and it's going to be for lubrication. Mucus is interesting in another way because it also is used to hold your feces together. So mucus is found throughout the digestive tract, and it's also going to be protective from pH, acidic conditions. And it's also packaging. Let's put it that way. That sounds so packaging of waste. Okay. The mucous membrane can also produce other things, such as enzymes. And it can also act as a site for absorption. It's very versatile, but the idea here is to produce something that is going to be protective as well as versatile. The epithelial tissue can vary. So anything from columnar to stratified to pseudostratified. Okay. So lots of different ways in which that epithelial tissue can manifest itself. The serous membrane is going to line body cavities that do not open to the exterior. Okay. And generally what we do is we find this, it lines the body walls, the body cavity walls, and organs. Okay. It is composed of simple squamous epithelium, simple squamous, epithelium, and a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. That would be its basement membrane. Okay. I've talked about this before. It has a visceral layer and a parietal layer. And those take on different names in different parts of the body. And you should know those names. So the pericardium, visceral layer, pericardium, parietal layer, plural, visceral, visceral pleura and parietal pleura, as well as the peritoneum. Okay, this membrane produces a fluid which is called serous fluid, and this is for lubrication. The final type of membrane is a synovial membrane. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'd never really talk about it other than this location. And so this is going to line the cavities freely movable joints. Okay. Does not, so this is the exception to the rule, does not contain epithelium. That sounds like a question on the exam to me. Okay. It does not contain epithelium, and in fact it is areolar connective tissue. Elastic fibers, and some fat. Okay. It also produces a fluid, and I bet you know the name of that fluid. That fluid is referred to as synovial fluid. Which is going to lubricate cartilage in the joint and also nourishes the cartilage that makes up the joint. Okay. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. We are done with this chapter. So, yahoo! I will start posting the next chapter, which is the integumentary system, soon. See you then.